Yeah. No, it's all good. I'll set this right here. Dwayne, if you would run the slides and when I tell you, if that's all right. Um, what I want to do this morning is over the last since the fall of last year and really over the last couple of weeks, one of the things that has been, if I had to guess on your mind, I know it's been on my mind, and particularly as I look out in the community, something that seems to be common to us all is this whole concept of grief and how to grieve. What do we do with grief? I know inside of our own community here at St. Paul, and then if you were to look at those communities that are part of our, just part of our life, maybe inside the greater Columbus area that might be, 2 or 3 steps removed. There's just been a lot of deaths that have been in our community, and so how do we approach that? One of the things that we struggle with as a group of people is really even how to talk about death. Death, we sort of approach it as it's taboo, or at least something that just talking about death raises our anxiety levels. And so naturally we struggle. And yet it's the most universal thing in this room. Whether you're a follower of Christ or not, it doesn't matter. One of the things that you will be exposed to, you yourself at some point, and then in your family or your social network, is that death affects us all. And in my experience, it really doesn't matter if there's been a long illness and then a passing, or whether someone passes suddenly. What we all perceive is that we're unprepared. Maybe unprepared to how to talk about it, maybe to process it. And so naturally we struggle. And there's good reason why we struggle with grief. It's inside the whole concept of grief, there are so many emotions that are attached to it. There's hopelessness. You feel out of control. You feel like your life is out of control. There's great levels of anxiety. How will I make it? What do I do next? What's my life going to be like? There's fear. There's anger. Often that gets played out in resentment. Sometimes we resent the one that passed. Sometimes we even resent God. There's all kind of struggles that we have, and the way we process that is with fear and anger. There's guilt, particularly if you're caring for someone, or if there have been unresolved issues in relationships and then that person passes. There's great levels of guilt. If you are a caregiver and someone passes, then what we feel is failure. Maybe that we let the loved one down. In any death, there's emptiness, there can be despair, and there's definitely loneliness. And then there's secondary issues that are tied to death. There are things like financial changes that could happen inside of a family. We don't talk about them. We don't know how to address them. There's friendships. If you're connected to someone, and then through that person, you then are connected to other people, and then that connecting piece, that person passes away, then those friendships often they fizzle out. And so there's then loneliness that people experience there. I bumped into someone, it's probably been a number of years now, and I grew up with the guy's older son, and the younger son passed away tragically, and it'd been a couple of years since I saw the father, and we played football and baseball together growing up, so we knew their families. They knew my family, spent the night at each other's homes growing up, and when I saw the dad, we bumped in, I think, at Publix, actually up on Bradley Park one day, and I've been to inquire about their life and what was going on, and he began to talk about, he said, "Shane, I'm unprepared for certain things. I didn't expect this." And I said, "Well, say more." He said, you know my family, we used to take a beach vacation every year, and we would go watch these football games, our favorite teams, and it was, all the guys went and participated. And he said, when my son died, he said, I can't even go to those places anymore. And he said, not only do I miss my son, I miss those places. And so there are these multi-tiers, these multi-levels when it comes to grief. There are primary things, and then there are these secondary things. To me, grief is like an earthquake. The best word I could use to describe it. I've only been in one earthquake. I don't recommend it. It was a terrible experience. We were in Costa Rica on a mission trip, and we were close to the border of Nicaragua, and about 200 miles into Nicaragua, there was like an 8.4 on the Richter scale earthquake, and by the time it got to us, it was about maybe a 7.8. It was in the middle of the night. We were asleep, and about 7 or 8 of these guys were all sleeping in this room, and in the middle of the night, we're suddenly we're awake. The beds are vibrating all over the place and up against the wall. All the things on the walls are falling down, and I remember being dazed. I remember being confused, and it was like this force was pulling on my midsection, and we felt paralyzed, couldn't even get out of bed. And then when the earthquake, and it went on for, I don't know how many minutes, it seemed like forever. And when finally it was over, there was a level of paralysis. It's hard for us to even get up out of the bed, and even to check on other people or what was going on with the building. And there were people even in our group that had all kind of levels of shock, which is a natural response to when someone is overwhelmed. Henry Nouwen, who I think is a very gifted writer. I don't know if you know anything about Henry Nouwen. He's a Catholic priest of the last century, died in the early 90s, very young, but wrote more about reflection on the spiritual life and reflective prayer than most. And one of the things that he actually did something when his when his mother passed away. He wrote letters to his father about what he was perceiving, and to help his father with his own grief. And one of the things that he said that I've always appreciated, says, when you lose someone that you love deeply, said grief can paralyze you. Emotionally, it can paralyze you physically, because when they die, part of us that's connected to them dies too. And since the fall, I've been reading a lot of the Psalms. The Psalms, to me, are some of the best expressions when it comes to grief, particularly Psalm chapter 6. And in verse 6, what the psalmist writes is, my groaning has worn me out. At night, my bed and my pillow are soaked with tears. And I think that's a very good description of what it's like when we grieve. And here's what I want you to know, all right, Dwayne? Grief is normal, natural, and it's very necessary. And yet for us, that's a struggle. See, we're created as human beings, which means that you're created to love and to be loved. And so then when that part that you love dies, then the natural expression is grief. And yet there's something inside of us, and maybe it's in our society that we live in, that sort of wants to condone us into this style of life that wants us to not be human. And yet to grieve, which is normal, natural, and very necessary, be human. Let yourself be human when you experience a loss. Don't try to be something you're not supposed to be. And yet, we're not any different, I would imagine. And there's something inside of us that pushes back on this. The first time I realized that this was important just for natural functioning is when I pastored a church in Macon called Forest Hills, about the size of St. Paul. And in the span of about 2 months, I officiated 17 funerals. And it's not just all 17 lived to be 99 years old, grand lives, and it was just easy stuff. I mean, this was all different ages of different people. Some after long illnesses, some died suddenly, some very young, some very old. And I remember thinking, really frustrated with myself, because I perceived that I wasn't strong enough. I mean, after all, it's just emotions, right? It's not like it's physical. like a broken arm or a broken hip or a broken back where, there's surgery and then there's rehab. And I remember I don't know why. I remember telling Brooke, I said, why am I struggling with this? It's not my family. It weren't my parents, weren't my brothers, my wife, weren't my children. I mean, it was levels of detachment. Just people I knew. I'd only been appointed there about a year and a half, so I only knew them for a year and a half. And then I realized what was going on. The issue was my discomfort with my own vulnerability. And I think therein lies some of the struggle for us when it comes to grief. See, other cultures do a far better job than what our culture does when it comes to grief. In other cultures, they're actually prescriptions. Some of them go up to 2 years long. You dress differently. I mean, even in the Old Testament, they wouldn't comb their hair. They wouldn't wash their face. They would wear different clothes. Sometimes they would even put dirt, ash on their face, and they wouldn't go out for a period of time, and they would change their diet. They would change what they do, and for a year, and sometimes even for 2 years. And the idea was that what I'm expressing to everybody else, what they see physically of me, is what's going on the inside. And yet we do the opposite, right? If someone dies, we wash and do, we got to present yourself a certain way, because we think to be vulnerable is to be weak. Because we pride ourselves on being fiercely independent or stoic. You know what stoicism is? Just what is what is. And I, rid myself of the emotional response and just process through life. And yet real strength is knowing your limits. I don't know who said this, but I definitely like it. It stuck with me throughout the years. It says, my tears are the words by which I tell God my pain. Which means then weeping is normal, natural, and necessary. I remember my mother and my grandmother, they moved in with my mother's uncle when my mother was about 6. And so they lived the majority of their life with my mother's uncle. I remember when my mother's uncle passed away. This was Brooke and I were just married, so at least about 25 years ago. We were sitting up in St. Francis Hospital, ICU area, and my mother's uncle had a heart attack, and so we knew it was a long shot. They rushed him to the hospital, and they were going to try a procedure to see if they could, save his life. And I remember when the physicians came out, and they told the family that he didn't make it. And I was sitting beside my grandmother, who was the greatest living saint I've ever known. And my grandmother, we were sitting around a table, and I remember when they told her, she put her head on the table and just wept uncontrollably. And you know what my first thought was? I called her Mamaw. Mamaw, you got to get this under control. There are about 40 people in this ICU waiting room. They're looking at us. She just kept on weeping. I don't have many regrets, but I wish I'd go back and replay that one. I'd tell her to weep on. Let it go. And then maybe I'd learn to do the same thing. I was embarrassed. But yet think about what happens when you lose a parent. I mean, it's your role model, or at least can be. And not only that, there's a level of where when we lose a parent, we then become face to face with our own mortality. Because the natural order is the parents pass away before the children, right? So then when the parents pass away, then that means we're now the parent. We're the ones who are at the top of the line. And so you're faced with your own mortality. Scary. maybe even for the first time. Loss of a spouse, the idea of my half has died. It's so much, we draw so much identity from our companions. And you think about what happens inside of marriage where you're sharing so many things. And then when that part is no longer there, it's everything that's associated with that spouse is now, that whole part of our identity is gone. A child. I'm not sure what is more unnatural than that. And there's something that just seems like a revolt to the natural order whenever that happens. I mean, it's the loss of hope, the loss of dreams, the loss of innocence. If there are degrees of hell on earth, I think this is definitely one of them. And so, are we just roll on? Friends, family members. I mean, again, our relationships are tied, and our identities are tied to the relationships that we're a part of. And so, when that part's gone, then it shocks us into change, which is so scary. And so, what will be, whether we like it or not, is we will have these types of experiences in life. Which means you're going to be faced with grief. And there's going to be a huge part of you that wants to resist that. That you're going to play in the back of your mind that what's required is for you to be stoic. What's required of you is to be fiercely independent. And yet, grief is the opposite of that. It's normal, natural, and necessary. You know, there are two scripture lessons that we're going to look at, and one of them is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. It says, "But we don't want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others who do not have hope." Now listen to that. What it says is that everybody's going to grieve. You either grieve with hope or you grieve without hope. But for those who follow Christ, we grieve with hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have died. So hold on to that for a second. What the scriptures don't say is that you don't have an out when it comes to grief. It says you're going to grieve. Everybody's going to grieve. The difference is, do you grieve with hope or do you grieve without hope? But the question is not, will you have grief? You will. It's what you do with it. Grief is not linear, which means that you go through it and then you graduate from this section and then you go to that section and then you graduate from that section and then you go to this section and then you graduate there and eventually when you get to the very end you've graduated and that's gone and you don't have anything to worry about. That's not what grief is. It's not linear. Grief is more like waves, which means that you're going to be impacted by a wave and then you're going to deal with that for a while, and then there's going to be a season for a bit, and then another wave is going to come, and it might or might not be as impactful as the previous one, but it's going to be seasons of waves. But you don't graduate. What you do is you just own the difference, but you do it with hope. See, we like what's linear. We don't grieve like others where there's no hope. We have hope. And it shows up in two ways. One, because you're created, and this is something to give thanks to God. You're created as a relational being. Then when you process life, even grief, then you process it relationally. Which means that grief is not designed to grieve by yourself. But you grieve with others. And what that does, that has this unique ability to spread the pain of the burden over multiple backs, not just one. which is painful as it is, it still lessens the load. That's part of the hope. But there's another part that's even better than this. That has everything to do with the resurrection. Which means that death is not the final event or the final chapter. Life is. That's what, when Paul gives commentary of what it means to grieve with hope, the way he gives commentary, it says for, which means let me substantiate what I just said. That if Jesus died and rose from the grave, then surely those who have died will be with him. And maybe the best passage in the New Testament to describe this is what we read at about 90% of the funerals for the right reason, John chapter 14. And I want you to see what's going on in this text. In the first first 4 verses, Jesus is answering the worry that the disciples have when it comes to death and grief. And that has everything to do with security. I mean, what's one of the concerns that you have when someone whom you love dies? It's where do I trust them to? I want security. Whether it be for parent, for spouse, for friend, for whoever it may be. I need to know that things will be secure when it comes to them, because that then will help me be at peace. 1 through 4. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way to the place where I'm going. Jesus is elaborating on security. Well, where do I trust those who have died? Well, you trust them to my Father. That wherever he is, there they'll be. Well, the natural response is verse 5. Thomas speaks for all of us. Lord, sounds a little too easy. We do not know where you're going. How can we know the way? Jesus, I got fear and anxiety. You want me to trust this trust just this idea that wherever God is, that's where they're going to be? So what does Jesus do in verse 6 and 7? He answers that fear. Well, how about this, Thomas? Trust that I'm the doorway. You're looking at me. Then trust me. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father. No one gets to verse 1 through 4 without me. So you can trust in me. And if you know me, you will know my Father also. And from now on, you do know him because you've seen me. Then verse 8 through 14 says, trust that I'm the doorway. I know it's kind of small print, but y'all know the passage. He's tackling this subject. Why? Because grief is normal, natural, and very necessary. And you don't get the option to opt out of grief. So the issue is, are you going to grieve with hope? Or are you going to grieve without hope? Later on in John chapter 14, Jesus goes on to talk about the Holy Spirit. And one of the things that he says to these disciples, and this whole concept of death is what they're talking about. He says the Holy Spirit will teach you everything, which implies learning. What did Paul say? I wouldn't have you be uninformed, unlearned. You can trust in me, even for those that have died. I don't know if you need that now, but I promise you there'll be a day where you do. You'll be faced with the idea of how to grieve. And you can grieve with hope, or you can grieve without it. Those are the only two options that exist. And the hope looks like this. You share it with other people, which means you don't bottle it up. You don't press it down. It's not about being fiercely independent or putting on a good face and being stoic and pretending that it does not matter. If you've loved and then lost, you'll be faced with grief. And you can share that with others, which makes the burden lighter. But the real reason is because death is not the final stage. Life is. And just because you can't see that right now does not mean it does not exist. And if you need to start in some place, you can trust him who's the way. Lord, in our society, it's a huge struggle for us. And so maybe the lesson we need to learn today is just that grief is natural. And even though that we've either been taught directly or indirectly that it's something we just have to push on through because we struggle with emotional pain. So maybe just teach us the first level, which is just to be comfortable with our own emotions. My tears are the words by which I tell God my pain. Teach us that, oh God. Help us to trust in you. And we pray this in the name of Christ.